Thank you so much, Catherine and Molly, for organizing. Hi, everybody. My name is Oren Pizmoni-Levy. I'm an associate professor at Teachers College and a member of the LEAP family or clan at this moment. We are very large and I'm happy about it. At Teachers College, we are leading one of the education activities with LEAP. In 2 weeks, we are going to have a summer institute for the third time for teachers in New York City, where they're going to engage with climate data science. But in addition to this work that I'm doing with my team, that includes Chris Torres, that is in the back of the room, and Noah Urbach and Enrivet, we are also doing research that speaks to issues of climate change, communication, education. And today we are having a presentation by Sarah Lewis. She's going to present a paper titled Any Questions Seeking Public Interest in Climate Change. Sarah just graduated from the master's program in international and comparative education at Teachers College. I had the privilege and honor of working with Sarah on this project for a long time. Although I'm mentioned here as a second author, Sarah is the really main author here. She did a lot of work on this, and she's going to share with you more. Most recently, this paper received the Emerging Scholar Award from the Center for Sustainable Futures at Teachers College. Sarah is the inaugural recipient of this award, and we are very excited about this. What else can I say about Sarah? Sarah finished a program in comparative education. She took classes that includes both quantitative research method and more substantive classes on climate, public opinion, etc. She brings all of this rich experience to this project, and I hope you'll enjoy. And we're looking forward to your questions later on. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Oren. All right, so it's great to see everyone. As far as Colorado, sounds very nice. I'm glad everyone has joined me today to look at our research, which, as Oren said, is called Any Questions Seeking Public Interest in Climate Change. This is a project I have been working on with two organizations, both of whom were introduced by Oren. However, I will quickly review. So we have LEAP, which everyone I think is quite familiar with, but I would just highlight that aside from their work around climate modeling, a core component of LEAP's work is knowledge transfer, and the idea of ensuring that their data is accessible to the public and that the public can engage this data meaningfully. So the other organization that Oren introduced, the Center for Sustainable Futures, is out of Teachers College, and it is a research center which seeks to transform education through original research and with the goal of empowering people to solve global and local environmental challenges. For some time now, CSF has been a key partner in LEAP's mission in strengthening this public understanding of climate change and amplifying LEAP's the impact of LEAP's research, doing things that, again, Oren just introduced, such as the Summer Institute and the Survey on Current Issues, which is a public opinion survey, which is in fact the subject, the data that we'll be looking at with this paper. So a little background. As is increasingly known, responding to climate change really requires action from across all sectors of society, not only government and industry and the sciences, but from the public as well. In the UNFCCC's Action for Climate Empowerment Framework, they cited not only education, but also public awareness as an essential tool in order to empowering the public to take on climate action. And I say that because while significant attention has been paid to studying climate change education in formal school settings, it's of course really important, particularly for those investing into responding to big socio-scientific challenges like climate change, that are increasingly defining our lives, to give attention to public awareness as well in our research, what the public knows, feels, and how they perceive these issues. And here we're looking at climate change. So in terms of how we should teach and inform the public, assuming that public awareness is important, Researchers agree on a few things. They agree that addressing knowledge deficits is not enough. It's not enough just to give people information and facts. Instead, or actually in addition, we really need to reach the public where they are, engage them in dialogue, be responsive to their views, their interests, their experiences. We therefore have to know what these are. And in doing that, until now, most efforts to sort of know the public and to reach them have actually used more like close-ended measures. So close-ended survey questions, let's say, defined top-down by the researcher, measuring people's, let's say, beliefs, their attitudes about climate change, their climate literacy, aspects of their identity, which researchers agree and have been useful in order to, as I said, sort of understand who the public is and how scientists and experts can better engage with them. But because so much time has been spent with these sort of close-ended measures, our aim with this research and having this public opinion survey at our disposal, our aim was really to build on these efforts by looking instead at an open-ended survey prompt, which allows us to measure and to observe how Americans think about climate change in their own words, in the dimensions that they use to define and how they think about climate change. So another thing I would say that because that with this research, we're really taking seriously the need to, one, to increase dialogue with the public, to narrow gaps between experts and the public. And for that reason, we specifically look at what questions Americans would ask about climate change. We ask 3 questions. The first question is, what do Americans want to know about climate change? Second is, what distinct profiles of climate change questions emerge based on themes identified in our open-ended qualitative data that I just referred to? And then lastly, how do different demographic traits and attitudes toward climate change predict one's membership in these latent profiles? And I promise I will return to what these profiles are shortly. So as mentioned prior, our data comes from the Survey on Current Issues, which is a public opinion survey designed to capture Americans' views on education and related current issues, including climate change. This was developed by Teachers College at Columbia at the Center for Sustainable Futures. The data was collected in March of 2023, and we utilized a nationally representative sample of 2019 adults, which was oversampled in order to appropriately capture populations of color. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, we have the survey question that was our question of interest. It reads, if you had an opportunity to speak with scientists/experts who study climate change, what would you ask them? What would you like to know about climate change? So as you can see, this is designed as a random split. So certain people received the question asking about scientists, others about experts. So the first step of our analysis consisted of qualitative inductive coding of this open-ended data, which produced a framework of 8 themes. And then in the second step, we performed a quantitative analysis, which included descriptive statistics, latent class analysis, and bivariate analyses using different socio-demographic and attitudinal variables available in our data. So this was a mixed methods approach. We started with our qualitative analyses looking at the data. And in fact, which we can get into later, over the quantitative component really took shape once we'd seen the data and sort of started asking different questions. But as we are today, it is a full mixed methods analysis. Now, for anyone who is less familiar with latent class analysis, although I suspect a lot of people here are more familiar with it than I am, I'll quickly define it. And latent class analysis is a statistical technique that classifies individuals into unobserved or latent groups based on patterns in their categorical responses. So if you have a data set and there are categorical responses in it, the latent class analysis is essentially identifying patterns within how different responses may be coded. So in our case, that would be patterns in how individuals' climate change questions were coded. This technique is particularly useful and interesting with research like ours, because by classifying individuals based on probabilities rather than fixed categories, we're able to account for more fluid and overlapping patterns in the data set, which we definitely had with this data set. Any questions? Are we okay? Finally, here's a snapshot of our sample. You can see the demographic composition as well as the distribution of a few attitudinal variables that we used in our analysis. As you can see, I'll give you a minute to look at it, but as you can see in the second column, we have political orientation, and then we have 3 questions: people's attitudes, beliefs about climate change. We have, how concerned are you about global climate change? How much do you think human activity contributes to global climate change? And how much do you think natural causes contribute to global climate change? Each of these 3 questions, all the questions here were asked on the survey. So that is where this data is coming from. And the numbers here are, of course, telling you the distribution of those different groups within our sample. Okay, I will move on a second, but we can come back to this if anyone has any questions. Okay, so now going to go through some results. We're going to first look at the engagement with the survey prompt. Then we will look at the themes identified in our qualitative component of our analysis. We will then look at the profiles that were identified through our LCA analysis. And then we will look at the differences in those profiles according to the groups that we just mentioned. Okay, so starting with the engagement, this is who answered the question and how, essentially. So here that we can see that out of 1,071 people who were prompted, meaning saw the question, 89% of them responded meaningfully. And by meaningfully, I mean that they asked a question, left a comment, a mix of question and comment. Excluded from that is merely people who skipped or left a nonsense or a nonsensical or a non-answer. So you can also see there that of those people who responded meaningfully, 69% posed a question, and some more if you consider those people in the mixed category. So essentially, while we definitely see that not all Americans feel the same way about climate change, experience climate change in the same way, interest is strong when prompted, and people certainly have things to ask and things to say. So that we feel is a good place to start with this study. Oh, and as you can see in the bottom, we did test for differences between scientists and experts, which was that split design, the experiment that was internal to the survey, but we didn't find any significant differences here in terms of engagement. Okay, so to our qualitative analysis, looking at these, I think it was a total of 906 open-ended responses to the question. After many rounds of coding, we identified 8 main themes. And I'll give you a minute to look at them. As well, I have provided some examples. However, the examples here don't capture the full breadth of the subject, but they should help define it. So we, of course, start with responses to climate change. What should be done? Is anything happening? Is it possible? Are things working? People asked about impacts of climate change. So how climate change interacts with different systems, how it will impact us, how it already is impacting us. Questions about causes. The scientific process, which contained several dimensions that could include questions about data, questions about communications of science, questions about projections, modeling, the interaction of scientists with other fields. Then we have general, which is sort of a catch-all for really general questions, broad questions. Mistrust in institutions or establishments. Denial, which is distinct in that it's more pointed and more specified towards climate change, denying the existence of climate change. And then lastly, evidence, which is people asking, inquiring about if climate change is true. How do we know? Is there evidence? And I will also note we have lots of more examples in the back, and they will be available in future reports. So I don't mean to give you such a small assortment, but for now, I hope that at least helps you understand the different dimensions. Okay, and so next, I'm going to show you the results of the frequency of these themes. And so here you can see which themes people cared about, wanted to know about the most. Answers could be multi-coded, so themes are not mutually exclusive, meaning these do not add up to 100. Somebody's answer could hit on a number of themes, which is why the numbers look like this. But again, as you can see, there's a clear winner. Over 50% of our sample wanted to know something about the response to climate change. Still large numbers wanted to know about impacts, causes. And then while the last themes may appear smaller, they're often interconnected and related. So you have questions about science, mistrust, denial, evidence. Again, they're smaller, but as we will see soon, how they interact with the other themes is interesting. So while we're looking at these themes, actually, I would say that our latent class analysis, when we're running it, what we're doing is we're looking at these themes and within these themes, trying to identify the patterns in the occurrence of these themes. I hope I said that correctly. So I will show you the results of the latent class analysis, but looking at these 8 themes right here, keep in mind that what the analysis is doing is sort of identifying the patterns in the assortment and the distribution of these themes throughout people's answers, how they showed up, how they overlapped or didn't overlap. So with that, I will show you here. You can see running our latent class analysis. We were able to identify 3 subgroups of questions, which we could also think of as 3 profiles of Americans or 3 profiles of questioners. These are types of questions asked and therefore types of people who have certain angle of interest around climate change. These 3 profiles we gave titles to ourselves, which include response seekers, impact probers, and consensus challengers. So these are the 3 profiles that the analysis produced for us. As you can see, 45% of our sample, people who answered the question, would fit into the profile of a response seeker. 17% would be considered consensus challengers based on the type of question they asked. And 38% would be considered impact probers. I should note that while the titles suggest that they are exclusive to what themes were selected, it doesn't mean that there wasn't crossover in the themes. So it doesn't mean that everybody who is a response seeker only asked about responses or only asked about impacts, et cetera. Okay, and so here, hopefully this becomes more clear, but in the following, I'm going to show you 3 charts for each of the profiles. And these charts, they're really meant to describe the composition of each of the LCA groups. So in this case, we are looking at the composition of response seekers. Those are 438 people in our sample were labeled as response seekers based on the types of questions they asked. And so here we can see what percentage of those people's questions were coded as all of our 8 themes. So it does show that nearly 100% were coded as response, and much smaller percentages, under 10, under 5, were coded as causes, science, general, mistrust, evidence. And it is that really points to some of the nuance in people's answers, and that hopefully will be illustrated in some of these examples in the box next to the chart. So we can see people are asking very straightforward questions about what's being done to reverse the effects, which would likely be coded as response. What are the causes and how can we stop it? So this is somebody that clearly is interested in both causes and responses. How are we going to stop it? Someone might ask, are electrical vehicles helping? Again, this is related to responses. But then you might hear somebody ask, why spend so much on it instead of other priorities? So this here's a question asking about the actual response and what is happening, but also questioning its validity, questioning associated consequences. And so in that case, we would have coded it both as response and mistrust. Here we can see the distribution of the themes in the impact probers profile, which includes 359 people in our sample. So here you see a little bit more variation. And again, that nuance of what you're seeing in the chart should be illustrated in some of these examples. So will it impact where I live? People asking about the future. A lot of people wanting to know what is going to happen and what those impacts will look like coming up and when. Have we reached the point of no return? How are melting icebergs affecting the sea level? So these are pretty clear impact questions. Then you have, are other countries interested in helping? And is it as extreme as our government wants us to believe? So here, this may not appear to be an impact question right off the bat, but you can hear somebody asking about severity. Sometimes you have people asking about how bad it will get. And sometimes people want to know the severity, if the severity of the impact is as bad as is said. And again, there we might have some multiple coding. Okay, finally, here's consensus challengers. The last profile, of which 179 members of our sample were fit into the profile of consensus challenger. Just take a look a second. So the first thing I would note is that these questions really touch on a range of themes beyond the traditional denial, rather touch on people's interest or concern with consensus positions and practices. So we see people challenging knowledge about what causes climate change, asking if it's just a cycle, like we see with the first question, isn't it just a natural cycle? We see people trying to make sense of seemingly conflicting history or observations or things they've heard, their own instincts, which you actually see in a couple of these questions. The third and the fourth question, is it not true that in the early 1900s, Chicago had unseasonably hot weather during the winter months? So while one could assume that this person is a climate denier, I think there's value in recognizing this person trying to reckon with information they have or an understanding they have with the consensus position. As you can see, how many times in history has the climate changed and what were the causes? Again, without assuming what the person's underlying beliefs about climate change really are, regardless, they are questions, and they're questions that can be answered. Also see, the second question, why does the data always change? This is a good example of a question that would have been in the scientific process theme, people asking about how data works, where it comes from, why is it that things feel different or wind up different than what they heard originally. So moving forward, we are aware, of course, that different groups are known to be associated with different beliefs and attitudes about climate change. This has been found in prior research. This was found in our own survey, such as the fact that more liberals are alarmed with climate change than conservatives. So knowing those findings, we really wanted to test the distribution of our LCA profile, of different groups across these different profiles to see which of the three LCA profiles different groups, let's say age groups, political groups, are members of. So for example, is it the case that all moderates are impact probers, or are all liberals response seekers? That's what we are really doing with these bivariate analyses. We've taken a number of our demographic and attitudinal variables from the survey, and we've seen how they interact, how they are distributed within these three profiles. Okay, so here's the results from a first analysis, and here we are looking at the three profiles by age. Now, here I would note that you do see that the membership in this profile does in fact correspond to what we know about the group. So for example, there are 55% of 18 to 24-year-olds are response seekers, which is more than groups that are older. So only 47% of the 65 plus, 43% of 45 to 64. So that seems to confirm something that we understood about age groups. At the same time, I think it would be important to notice that while, for example, more older people are consensus challengers than younger people, you can see that 29% of 65 plus are consensus challengers versus the 8% of 18 to 24-year-olds that are consensus challengers. That is really important. And it's also important to note that 47% are response seekers and 24% are impact probers. So not everyone who is 65 and plus is merely interested in consensus, in challenging the consensus. And so I think one thing that is to note in this data is both how it teaches us patterns that exist about groups, which are valuable and I think will help us in learning how to approach these groups, but also how there are differences within those groups. Okay, so here we're looking at by politics, looking between liberal, moderate, and conservative. Here you have a similar pattern, if not a little bit even more defined, in which only 27% of conservatives are response seekers versus, let's say, 58% of liberals, 46% of moderates. Conversely, 7% of liberals are consensus challengers, not very much, versus, let's say, 33% of conservatives. Here, though, I think it's interesting that there are, within the conservative group, there are more consensus challengers than there are response seekers. So that there is a difference between, let's say, conservatives and the 65 plus group. Also looking at moderates, you have 14% of moderates are consensus challengers, 40% impact probers, and 46% response seekers. So a lot of variation and a lot of different kinds of questions and interests. Okay, now here is by level of concern. So this was how concerned somebody is with climate change. And here you see, again, similar patterns, but with even greater polarization. You have 56% of those very concerned are response seekers, and only 6% of the very concerned are consensus challengers. Only 20% of, one way to look at it, would be only 20% of the not very concerned are response seekers, whereas almost 40% are consensus challengers. And then again, with the somewhat concerned, you again have a pretty wide distribution. You have 46% are response seekers, 37% impact probers, and 18% consensus challengers. So again, while there's a clear pattern for, let's say, an educator or a communicator, somebody interested in reaching the public, another way to look at this would be that, yes, while 39% of those who are not very concerned are interested in challenging the consensus, 1 in 5 of those, 20% of them, do have questions about responses. And so we need to be prepared to know what those questions are and also to engage them at that point. I think it's really interesting that also 20% of, or 18% of the impact probers do have questions about the consensus, so that consensus challenging, let's say, is not exclusive to a far right or a fringe position. And again, 6% of the very concerned, let's say, do have questions that would put them in the profile of being a consensus challenger. Okay, a last analysis I will show you, this is by education. Now, education I'm showing you because it's a little bit of an outlier. It's interesting. As you can see, the difference between people with a college degree or higher and people with a high school degree or less is in fact sort of the inverse. 46% of people with a high school degree or less are response seekers, whereas only 44% fewer of people with a college degree would be considered response seekers. Even more interestingly, 22% of people with a college degree or more are consensus challengers, and 14%, so fewer of the people with a high school degree or less, are consensus challengers. So what are we seeing? We're seeing that going to college, having a college degree or more, doesn't actually make one less likely to have doubts, to express skepticism, to raise questions about consensus positions. Okay, we do have a couple more analyses, which again, I can show you after if we have time. But before we get there, I just want to conclude sort of main points that we learned with this work, which is the first thing, as I said, people are interested in climate change. 89% of Americans, when prompted, took the opportunity to engage the question, write something, sometimes write extensively, something to say to a scientist or expert, to ask an expert very often. Again, mostly asking questions, but also making some comments, demands, sharing a mix of all three. So interest is high, and there is certainly an opportunity. Next, we saw, or we were able to identify 3 profiles of Americans based on the kinds of questions they ask about climate change, what they say about climate change. And looking at those profiles, I think we can say 3 things. The first is that profile membership is not equal. So 43% of people in our sample are response seekers, meaning they're interested in what can be done, what is being done, is it going to work, is it working, has it been a waste, any question related to our response. And that's good. If for those in the field of thinking about how we respond, should be recognized that there is interest and a want to know. We then have 23% of our sample are impact probers, so people interested in what is coming in the future, what the impact will look like, what is happening, what interactions are happening now, how severe it is, how lethal, how worried people are. And then we have 18% are consensus challengers. The next thing that I think we were able to see is that our profile membership, meaning which groups are, sort of what's the composition of each profile, it does correspond with the demographic groups and some of what we know about them from prior studies. So as an example, it is true that there are more conservatives who are consensus challengers than moderates or liberals. So that's the case, and that's important as a way of sort of reaffirming what we've learned both in this study and in the past. And as I said, as a way to learn and engage with the public. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize, as I started illustrating, is that the groups, meaning where somebody's from, what their demographics are, what they feel, what they believe, what their politics are, they're actually diverse in their profile membership, or rather what kind of questioner they are, what kind of questions they ask, what they're interested in climate change. So it is not the case that we can make blanket assumptions about a group or demographic based on what they're, we can't assume what they're interested in entirely based on what group they're a part of. So again, we saw that there are plenty of conservatives who want to know about responses. There are people who are not concerned, claim to be not concerned about climate change, who have questions about the impacts, who do have questions about the consensus or even just how it works. And so I think, again, for when we're thinking about applying this research and reaching the public, this is as important a point as the other two. Okay, so what does this mean for educators? I might be harping on at this point, but I think, one, it's important, or at least it's another idea, to classify people by what they know instead of who they are. So if we have this tool to start thinking of the public in terms of what their questions are, what they're interested in, it might offer more opportunities for reaching them rather than just, again, basing it on who they are and what those values are. And following on this, I think we really can see that we have an opportunity here. We can treat questions as opportunities for engagement. And again, so returning to the idea that deficit education is not enough. It's not enough to give people the facts. Questions, again, offer opportunities. They offer opportunities for learning new things, for clarifying, for also teaching people the process of learning itself. And for that, I think this data could offer a lot also to educators in the classroom, as well as, again, offering actual data for scientists, communicators, people wanting to know the public better. And I should say this idea of questions as points of engagement should be the case for people who are across sort of the spectrum. Those who are already concerned, yes, we have people who are highly concerned with climate change. But what we're seeing in our data is that a lot of those people don't know what can be done. They don't have answers about what they themselves can do, what is happening. And this, as we've seen with research, often can lead to paralysis, and it can lead to a sense of despair, uncertainty, anxiety that is unproductive, and also, again, not taking advantage of the fact that we have a lot of answers and things to share with them. So as much as people who are concerned, we shouldn't dismiss them just because they believe and just because they're concerned should not be a reason to, again, not engage them. Of course, for those who are not concerned, those who are skeptical, those who tend towards, some shade of denialism, I think questions, again, are an opportunity to not just to engage, but to build, we can build bridges, we can model also. I think there's an opportunity to sort of model and defy expectations about experts and scientists in ways that perhaps would sort of, again, contradict their own questions. And we can build trust, which is something that we know is really needed right now for climate change, as well as a number of other issues. So I think that we do see, not only does this data allow us to learn something about the public, but it offers us an opportunity to engage the public as well. So I think I've sort of gone on this, but thinking about why should scientists care about informing the public? I have no doubt that everyone in this room cares about informing the public. So this feels a little bit unnecessary, or at least a place that I could probably learn from you all. But again, people are really necessary to the response to climate change. It is not symbolic. We need people to push, at this point, resist policy, to buy into changes, to adaptation, behavioral and other, to build resilience in their communities. And again, it's not enough that a majority of Americans, we say, believe in climate change at this point. It's been found that belief and concern are really not enough to always encourage the requisite action. And we also know that we need people to be invested. It's been found people have to have a sense of collective and self-efficacy, a sense that they can actually do something that makes an impact, or that the collective can actually make an impact. And as well, there's the subject of socioscientific literacy, which again is a subject that I'm sure everyone has more familiar with than myself, but this is a space that I think, despite some people's apprehension of increasing literacy around climate change in terms of the science, I think that there's really a need moving forward in the world that we live in, that people have the basic capacity to engage these complex, nonlinear issues, of which there are, increasingly more. And then finally, yes, numbers around denial are down. However, mistrust, as we know, resistance to established positions is up, is spreading, and is not on the fringes entirely. So it's just not quite an option to be able to sort of dismiss the denial component, even though it is certainly smaller, and that is, of course, a good thing. So I think I'm going to leave it for there. We have a lot of other data in the back and things to discuss. I would mention, so we are wrapping up a report with this data. We are working on a paper for publication. There is a lot of data here. There is a lot of opportunities to dig into a lot of the sub-themes that we identified, to do further quantitative analyses. And then I know that there's also intentions of making this data available to teachers, and to develop programming around these questions. And anything else any other ideas that anyone else has, I know we're eager to hear. So with that, I think I will pause, and if anyone has questions, or we can move from there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hopefully you could hear me. This was fantastic. I want to let the people online know that if you type questions in the chat, we'll be sure to read them out. Also, if you would like to unmute yourself, you're also free to do so. I will walk around in the room with a mic for any questions or comments people have for Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. Super interesting. I guess to your last point, I was wondering, will these questions be made available to scientists as well as teachers, that maybe we could answer them? And my other question is, when you were doing the latent analysis, was that being done using the pre-human categorized things that you were showing of the 8 different categories, or was that directly on the text of the responses themselves? Thanks.
Of course. To your first question, I probably misspoke. Yes, it will be made available to scientists. I do think that is the intention, and there's likely that some people here can speak more to that than I know of, at least the status of that. But yes, I think it should be made available to scientists, and I assume that it is in the process of being made available to scientists as well, who are educators, and I didn't mean to create a barrier between the two. And to your second question, yes, and I can be correct if I'm wrong about this, but we ran the LCA on the data, taking account the themes, not the text. Is that, or am I saying that correctly? I was a student, so I'm not perfect on this.
No.
But
Sarah is describing it correctly. We ran the LCA on the themes that Sarah identified. So another approach will be to have topic modeling, where the machine will read the text and come up with some other patterns. However, the problem with using topic modeling is that it requires longer text in order to come up with robust topics. So here we took another approach, and Sarah coded the data not once, not twice, but 6 or 7 times. And then we used the LCA to come up with the profiles. And I would love to hear who is the person that asked us these 2 great questions so we can follow up later. What's the name?
Oh, Kate Loftus.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. And excited to see the data. It seems super interesting.
Sure. We will make sure to find a way to share it with others.
Amazing. Yes, we have another question in the room.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious that for those who asked about evidence, the ratio is quite low. And to me, that's a little alarming because that supports your decision. Like that's kind of that's very important part. But some people just don't think about it and almost like have an opinion. So I wonder what you think of that.
I really like that observation. Most people don't notice the evidence theme because it is so small, and it does, even though it is distinguished from the others, it stands on its own. And you're right, it's the other themes suggest greater level of certainty, or an acceptance of things than the evidence theme. I'm going to take you there just to show you, because let's see here. Okay, here's a few more examples. Is it real? Prove it. Where is the evidence? What proofs do you have that climate is changing? What I actually found interesting about this theme is that initially, or at some point, I think, again, it's another one that could be sort of dismissed as being denial, but in fact, it's people who I think are, again, asking questions and sort of wanting to have it indicates that there is that evidence is important, that understanding the why is important, whether or not they're skeptical or not. They want the why, and I think that again, like I was saying, is a good quality and something that should be answered, and something that, again, we should celebrate rather than dismissing it as, oh, well, could be dismissed as, well, don't you know, of course it's real, why do you need the evidence? So I think the reason that it's so small, might partially be due to just there's some overlap between the themes. There are also questions within scientific process that we're also asking about the evidence. Let's see if I have them here. You can see we had more themes at some point, which is why there's here. Okay. So you have some people asking about data, asking about how it works, which I do think is more aligned. It's also is a smaller percentage, but I think they're great questions, and I like seeing them. And I would hope there would be more of them. I hope that answer your question.
Sure, thanks.
Hello, my question was about the graph that you were showing between like college educated students and then people who have a high school diploma or less. I was wondering, because it was kind of a surprising metric, that there was a greater percentage of consensus challengers in the college educated group. Do you guys believe that this is consistent with the general population? Is it just maybe an artifact of this study? And is there any interesting relationship or anything else you can tell me about, maybe relationship between I don't know, political affiliation and college degree and, the consensus challenger percentage, something like that? Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't have that specific, I didn't look at it with that specific angle. I would like to. And also I'm not convinced that it is not distinct to this study, but that comes from my background. And again, there being a lot of themes and just not taking the opportunity to really dig into why that is. I would encourage anyone to do it. But again, if there's somebody who has knows more on this subject, can chime in. But let me just look, because I do. Excuse me.
Sarah, I have another suggestion. Can the person that asked the question repeat it again? I think I lost the beginning. What was the question about the difference based on education?
The question was, the first part was, do you guys believe that the difference based on education, that being that people with a college degree have a higher percentage of consensus challengers, is consistent with the general population, or is it just, something that just happened to be true in this study, but that if we were to poll the entire population, it wouldn't hold?
Okay, so the answer to that is, I think, is very simple. When we ran statistical analysis on this data, we did find that the difference between these two groups is statistically significant, meaning that we would expect to find it in the population as well. So I think that's answer the first part of the question on whether we would expect this difference in the population. The second part that Sarah responded to, the why this is happening, I don't think we have a good story yet of what's going on here. The pattern, as you can see, is mostly around the consensus challengers. It's not about the response seekers, and it's not so much into the impact probers. It's really about the consensus challengers group that is growing dramatically. So we don't have a good explanation yet. This is what Sarah was saying a minute ago, that we need to look even further into the data to see what can explain out the difference based on education. But going for your first part of the question, this is something that we will expect to find in the population. Again, you can see the comment in the bottom right of the screen that the pattern is statistically significant below 0.01, meaning that we are taking a risk of 1% that we are off.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah and Oren, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.